Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to all of you to this webinar organized by Chatham House on the UN Cybercrime Convention, implementing a treaty and managing risks. My name is Joyce Hackmey. I'm the Deputy Director of the International Security Program at Chatham House, and I have the pleasure to be moderating this session today. As it is known to most, a UN Cybercrime Convention has been a controversial issue even before it became a reality. For many years, states have been at odds over whether there is a need for a UN Cybercrime Convention, up until 2019, where 79 states voted in favor of Resolution 74247 at the UN General Assembly, 60 against, and 33 abstained. This led to the establishment of the ad hoc committee mandated with developing a cybercrime convention. Now, the official name of the convention is the International Convention on Countering the Use of Information and Communication Technologies for Criminal Purposes. So it is a bit of a mouthful. So in today's event, we will be referring to it as the Cybercrime Convention. However, as we will note later, the name of the convention itself and what should the offenses that it includes be referred to is one of the areas of contention. When states started their negotiations at the beginning of last year, unsurprisingly, numerous areas of disagreement emerged. This is largely due to the different ways in which states conceive of cybercrime, respond to cybercrime in their jurisdictions, and approach cyberspace governance more generally. As a result, questions about the scope of this convention, what should be considered cybercrime, what to call it, cybercrime or criminal use of ICTs, when states should cooperate, when they should refuse cooperation, what kind of safeguards should be included to protect against the abuse of the highly intrusive investigative powers granted through the convention and others, all became points of contention. To date, states have convened 6 times to negotiate the various chapters of the convention. While consensus has been reached on some issues, disagreement persists on some of the most crucial ones mentioned earlier. Following the 5th session, Ambassador Mubaraki, the chair of the process, attempted to reconcile divergent views by developing a draft convention based on the consolidated proposals states have made throughout the process. This draft, while making certain compromises and attempting to accommodate various perspectives, left unaddressed some of the significant concerns repeatedly raised by civil society, industry representatives, and of course, some member states. These concerns revolve around the potential for the convention to criminalize expression and dissent, facilitate cross-border repression, and grant extensive surveillance powers, among others. On the other hand, member states seeking a broad cybercrime convention were also dissatisfied. This situation led to the 6th session bringing back nearly all proposals made throughout the process, which meant that by the end of the session, the draft convention doubled in size, putting in question prospects for progress and opening the door for many possibilities for the next steps in the process. Last week, the chair released the revised draft of the convention, building on the 6th session. This revised draft is meant to act as the basis of the discussions for what is supposed to be the concluding session in the process, which will be held in New York from the 29th of January to the 9th of February of next year, 2024. In that draft, the crucial issues that states are most divided on remain undecided, and the risks that have been highlighted remain unaddressed. In fact, new areas of concerns have emerged with this draft. The approach that the last draft adopted is meant to keep open the informal discussions. However, for many, they view the strategy as diminishing the prospects of a favorable outcome during the concluding session, and for others, puts into question the fate of this process and the different possibilities that might materialize. We come together today at a very crucial time in the process, bringing a stellar group of experts from academia, civil society, and industry who have been closely following the process and engaging in its proceedings to reflect on this revised draft. The objective of our discussion today is to explore together how member states, as they conclude this process, can ensure that if they agree on the convention, that this convention becomes a positive legal tool for the global fight against cybercrime, one that can drive regulatory harmonization efforts, streamline international cooperation, and improve investigative techniques and capacity building, while at the same time minimizing the identified risks, so it does not end up becoming a UN convention that legitimizes oppressive practices in the name of fighting cybercrime. So I'd like to introduce our panelists, starting with Amy Bruyette, who's the Director of Advocacy at the International Press Institute, Raman Jeet Singh Chima, the Asia Policy Director and Senior International Counsel at Access Now, Caitlin Ringrose, Global Policy Lead for Law Enforcement and Government Access at Google, Ian Tennant, Head of the Vienna Multilateral Representation and Resilience Fund at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. And last but certainly not least, Tatiana Tropina, Assistant Professor of Cybersecurity Governance at Leiden University. Welcome to all of you, and it's great to have you with us today. Just a couple of logistical points. This event is on the record and will be recorded. You are encouraged to tweet if you like to, and you can use hashtag #CHEvents. And importantly, you can use the Q&A functions to ask questions. We have an hour and a half together, so we are hoping to have plenty of time for your questions. So please do send them at any point in the discussions, and my brilliant colleagues working behind the scenes will make sure that they will get to me. And the last thing I want to say is that this event is part of a Chatham House project that we've been doing since the beginning of this process that aims at bringing multi-stakeholder views into this process. We've been doing quite a lot of work and analysis on the issue of mainstreaming gender into this convention around human rights perspectives and others. And this project is funded by Global Affairs Canada. So with that, I'd like to turn to all of you for a joint question, really. I spoke in my introduction about the draft 2 and about some of the feedback that this draft has received. And I want to turn to you for your comments about what are the things that kind of stood out for you, what are the things that you're mostly concerned about, and maybe whether there are any positive aspects that you'd like to highlight. So I'll go in the order I can see on my screen, starting with Ian, Caitlin, Tanya, Amy, and Raman. Ian, over to you.
Thank you very much, Joyce, and for to you and everybody at your team at Chatham House for organising this event. As you said, you've been coordinating and facilitating engagements throughout this whole process, and it's great to continue to be a part of it. I think a general perception on the new draft compared to the first draft, which was published in the summer, is that at least in terms of structure and issues, it's very similar. And as you said, it's most of the big issues that have kind of characterized the negotiations have yet to be addressed. So whether that's the title, whether that's on the kind of list of specific crimes, we still don't see any move towards consensus. But on top of that, unfortunately, this new draft has moved away from what we and I think many in the multi-stakeholder community would see as an effective draft, which reduces risks. In fact, the second draft has moved quite clearly away from where consensus might be and towards a very vague and ambiguous direction. I think that's true on scope. It's definitely true on safeguards. And both of those issues, therefore, have a direct impact on the cooperation parts, which itself has its own ambiguousness and vagueness as well. I mean, looking through the different chapters of the text, there are several layers of the types of offences or activities that could be included. From the offences criminalised, from the offences on which evidence can be shared, and including references to crimes under other treaties that are carried out with the use of ICTs, references to sharing evidence on any criminal offence, as well as references to serious crimes without any kind of explanation or qualifier. And I think overall, this ambiguity has done nothing to assuage fears that the treaty could be used to support transnational repression of individuals and groups who could be carrying out activities like journalism, research, and others exercising their rights as protected under international human rights law. So taken together as an initial reaction, as drafted, the draft that we see, and as we understand it, the basis on which delegates will go to New York at the end of January, beginning of February, could have a very damaging effect on society's ability to work against cybercrime, conversely. From our organization's perspective, one of the strongest indicators of resilience to crime generally, including cybercrime, according to our research, is a free media, rule of law, space for civil society to operate. And as it's drafted, this treaty could shrink that space for civil society to play its part, and could actually end up not only being damaging for rights, but damaging for efforts against cybercrime.
For this overview, and I'll come back to you on some of the things that you mentioned, but I'd like to go to Caitlin next, please, for her overall feedback on the draft.
Thank you, Joyce. I have to say I agree completely with Ian. I'm here to discuss the convention from the point of view of a member of industry, focusing on how, as drafted, it would impact Google's users, including their privacy, safety, and security on the web. First off, it's just important to mention that this draft isn't just the newest version. It is intended to be final, or as near final as possible. And when drafting a convention with this much impact, member states should enshrine appropriate safeguards around access to data. They should ensure that the convention is grounded on due process and human rights, and should utilize as many transparency tools as possible as available to them. At the moment, though, like Ian mentioned, the treaty could end up doing more harm than good. For example, rather than just encouraging cooperation and stakeholder involvement to combat serious crimes, the convention's very expansive criminalization section features a number of really vague and oftentimes innocuous online behaviors, right? Including a new crime about deceiving someone online. And member states are required to transpose this list of crimes into their own national law. So there's not optionality here. At this point, reading the newest version, there's almost no behavior one can engage in online or even on their own device that is not captured by the convention as a crime. That includes behaviors that are intended to benefit users of the web. So for example, right now, the convention criminalizes access to a computer without right. That means that people who keep us safe from online threats, including pen testers and security researchers, are, by nature of the current convention, illegal actors. This, of course, includes many of Google's employees, as well as individuals who outside of industry work as ethical hackers, really discovering vulnerabilities to keep all of us safe online. Finally, I'm concerned that new edits to the final draft allow for cross-border retrieval of electronic evidence in secrecy and without reasonable procedural safeguards.
Okay, thank you, Caitlin, and also kind of an important list of issues that you're identifying here, which overlap with also what Ian has mentioned. Tanya, over to you. You've been working on cybercrime for several years, including on the draft study on cybercrime. I think that was developed 10 years ago, if not more. How do you read this draft? What are your main comments on it?
So my main comments, first of all, I endorse absolutely everything what Ian and Catherine said. I mean, there would be a bit of overlap. It's hard to add something reasonable to what they already said. I want to add a bright side, though. On the bright side for me, if we looked at August at the last substantive session, I'm very happy that many of the additions proposed, which created overreaching criminalization like terrorism material, extremism material, and some other things, they did not make it there. But as Kathleen said already, basically, if we look at this convention as a whole, they're still captured. they still can be prosecuted, and there could be still oppression on speech genuinely within the framework of this convention. So there was a bright side. At least it did not go as far as criminalize certain type of expressions. Or not so bright side. From the perspective of criminalization, the additions to articles on fraud, which Kathleen mentioned already, also on the additions to the offenses related to child online sexual exploitation, do not make it better and raise more concern than the previous draft, at least for me. And I want to have a comment on the approach to this draft. I can only commend all the efforts of the chair, of the ad hoc committee chair, to reach consensus, to bring the parties together, and at the same time to publish this draft and to get us informed. But as the previous speakers mentioned, we look at this draft and none of the issues where we had serious grave concerns have been resolved. They are all in italic text. So my question here is, for us, for non-governmental stakeholders, how can we actually provide any reasonable, any sensible, any valuable input when all we can do is just speculate what is going on there? Because what I see, if I take it as a face value, I see the same provisions and they have not been changed. So it is very hard to suggest real improvements because I don't know what has been suggested there in the negotiations. Kind of grudge against the chair. I understand that this is the politics of negotiations, but nothing has changed in terms of improvements. So yes, and commenting on what has not been changed, my concerns remain the same. From the investigative powers with lack of safeguards to lack of proper safeguards and vagueness of provisions on international cooperation, whether it's the definition of serious crime taken outside of the context of other international conventions, to the reference in the in Article 17 to criminalization in other international treaties, and so on and so forth. The list can go long. My main concern, if I look at it into the future, if it is adopted as it is or closely to what it is, I just want the states to be aware that there is no way back. We are setting criminal justice in cyberspace for years and decades to come. Some states perhaps think about e-evidence and digital investigations as a Wild West because there are providers, there are states who cannot get data, who cannot exchange data. You will not solve the Wild West with this convention. In the best case, you will legitimize some Wild West. And this is not a thing that could easily be undone. So this is my main concern. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. So important messages here about, the implications of this convention if it goes ahead with this approach, and the point you mentioned around, yes, the big, very long list of crimes that was initially being discussed didn't make it into the final draft. However, there is this catch-all article, right, that can bring them back, and as Caitlin mentioned, that almost like any behavior can be criminalized if a state wants to. Amy, over to you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, and thank you, Joyce, and to Chatham House for organizing this discussion. So, I share, the concerns of other panelists. My reaction to this draft is it's incredibly disappointing and very concerning from a press freedom standpoint. As others have said, the draft, really didn't address any or resolve any of the key issues that have been at the center of the debate since the outset, namely, the scope of the convention and lack of human rights safeguards. So the latest draft actually kind of reinforces IPI's concerns about the impact the treaty could have on journalists and on freedom of the press in general. And we've been very concerned all along about the potential for this treaty to become another tool for authoritarians and repressive states to target and punish journalists and other critics. And as we've heard, the draft gives governments incredibly intrusive surveillance powers to investigate a range of unspecified serious crimes, And this, for journalists, this would have a very serious implications for many journalists around the world, including those that work both domestically and the thousands of journalists who have actually moved into exile over the past few years. And I think in general, this treaty comes at a time when journalists and press freedom are under great pressure and strain in many countries around the world. The work of journalists has become more difficult and more dangerous in many places, from physical harm to legal threats to market pressures. Meanwhile, this treaty was put into play by states with some of the worst records on press freedom and online censorship in the world. And this raised immediate alarm bells for IPI and other press freedom organizations, since many of these countries are already abusing domestic cybercrime laws to target journalists. So, from the very early stages of this negotiation, the earliest drafts had all of the problems of domestic cybercrimes legislation. And this included kind of vague and overbroad scope of the possible crimes covered under the convention. It's become clear that the treaty has less to do in many ways with addressing core cybercrimes, but is more of an effort by authoritarian governments to expand their own surveillance powers with this, kind of powerful multilateral tool. And I think for IPI, what was so striking for us is that we know already how these laws are being abused by governments, that this is not an unknown. The examples of the cybercrimes laws being used and abused against journalists and civil society are so abundant and so pervasive, it's actually kind of difficult to choose which ones to highlight. So the evidence of how such laws are being used in practice tells us that we need that a treaty of this nature needs to be narrowly scoped, and it needs to be infused with strong human rights safeguards in order to prevent overreach and abuse. And I think this is what so many civil society experts and industry experts had been calling for throughout this process. And so that's why it's so disappointing to see this latest draft, in which essentially really doesn't incorporate any of our recommendations. And as the draft stands, the treaty could really kind of create a global surveillance dragnet that could give repressive governments even more tools to target and muzzle journalists, and could also require other governments to facilitate these attacks against journalists by making, these highly intrusive surveillance powers available for cross-border investigations.
Thank you very much, Amy. And I'd like to come back to you maybe after Roman to kind of follow up on the practical examples and what you see around the world of these national laws that are being used against journalists. But over to you, Roman. From Access Now's point of view, what are your assessment of the draft? And are there any areas where you think, well, there has been some progress?
Happy to speak about that, Joyce, and thank you so much. I think it's useful to explain first why we're engaged in this. Why is this an issue that we care about, and perhaps it may relate to some of our viewers today, why they should be interested in this and should engage further. Access Now is an international civil society organization that focuses on advancing and protecting digital rights, and in particular, furthering and strengthening digital security. We recognize that technology and the internet can empower, but it also places people at risk. And what we do as part of that is to run a global digital security helpline that assists journalists, civil society, and human rights defenders on their digital security needs, in addition to tracking policy developments and advocating for digital rights interests in these issues there. So we're very aware that technology can be misused to harm people, and that legal frameworks can help strengthen and protect people's rights, but it depends on what you do and how those frameworks are designed. And in that context, it is important to look at this particular instrument. As many of my co-panelists have mentioned, it has had a contested origin and indeed a contested title, although I always laughed at the fact that the email address of the Secretariat for this clearly says Cybercrime AHC. Does seem to indicate they also know which way this is going. But I think it's important here to acknowledge that states have expressed a particular need. States have said that they do want more international legal guidance, legal harmonization, and potentially legal cooperation. So we recognize those interests, particularly coming from a large number of majority world, or what people sometimes refer to as global South states. Our standard, though, on what should guide this process and what states should consider has been very clear. States should only sign on to a finalization of this process, this EHC product, and a final UN treaty, and we should only sign on and ratify this treaty if it is very clear and narrowly defined in its scope, if it outlines very specific, strong safeguards built on international human rights standards, and as Amy very importantly pointed out, it recognizes how existing cybercrime frameworks across democracies and authoritarian countries are often abused, sometimes due to gaps, but sometimes due to intentional steps by actors in government or in power, as well as ensuring more broadly that any international cybercrime treaty does not make us more cyber insecure, namely that it helps advance strong and robust cyber security and the security and integrity of all of our networks and personal data. And the simple test, Joyce, that I would go by, like answering your question, is this draft doesn't have some of the more really disturbing proposals we have seen over the part of the negotiation process. But does it meet that standard? In our view, unfortunately, no. This is a very disappointing text, even compared to the finalization. Linking it back to the end of the August negotiating session, even by that standard, this text should have done more, should have locked down some of these provisions and chapters, and it's not done so. In many ways, it leaves them open, and as Ian and others have also hinted to, it actually backtracks in many concerning areas, and even in the sort of aversion to human rights language, or in many parts of the current draft text where it removes specific reference to civil society to a more general term of stakeholders. I'm concerned, not necessarily on even the terminology choice, but in the preferences that seem to be guiding the negotiating team, or at least the final secretariat product right now. I think in particular, what I'm concerned about is that this treaty would make us more cyber insecure. And this is something that Caitlin referred to briefly as well. And that's why I'm concerned that it doesn't seem to recognize the reality of how cybersecurity and how networks and ICT products and services function today, but also on how abuse takes place and how we need to protect the human beings responsible for cybersecurity. And a simple, perhaps easy area that the Secretariat and others could have addressed and fixed was the scope of the treaty, and particularly the section on criminalization. What provisions, what sorts of crimes should be universally criminalized by all the signing states? And simple language around tightening intent of potential core cybercrimes, making sure that things that do not have a clear requirement, that are unintentional, are not criminalized, that states put in safeguards around legitimate security research, but also legitimate security activities conducted by journalists, by activists, and others should be protected, have not been undertaken here. And the sort of defenses we've seen have been alarming. We've seen that some states and some delegations, and even sometimes people involved in the drafting process say, well, we have provided safeguards. We have said in one article that authorized penetration testing is enough. And I would say, please go today to the bug bounty websites such as HackerOne, or go to all the security research programs run by for-profit or not-for-profit tech platforms. Majority of security research that takes place today is not directly authorized, although it is under ethical, responsible frameworks. You don't have a contract with the security researcher who might find a zero-day exploit in your system, but that sort of research should be protected. Instead, this treaty would criminalize that. And in effect, what it would mean is many countries who are creating new cybercrime laws based on this treaty would be starting from an already flawed, problematic situation. And the signal sent out to the world actually is that let's not learn the mistakes of cybercrime laws and the misuse of them that we've seen in so many other areas. And the last of the area I'll see that this draft is particularly alarming on is international cooperation. We're seeing actually a more explicit effort being made to try and share traffic data and even do live interception. And these have been areas that many delegations in the process have expressed extreme alarm on. And we still see it kept in the process, even though perhaps at least up to 20 to 30% of the negotiating states have said this is a red line area for us. And that makes me wonder, is this text even possible to sign on to? We'll have to see, but at a more basic level, is this the text that we hope to see in December, perhaps 60 days before the final conclusion of this negotiating process? Unfortunately, not. This isn't something that we thought would be in this form. It needed drastic improvement. Instead, we have something that may result in a lack of agreement at the end of this process in New York in February.
Thank you very much, Roman. If I just want to summarize what you all said, this draft, is it the worst case scenario? Probably not. However, it is still concerning and disappointing, and there's a lot of loose ends and issues that need to be addressed. And you all talked about your concerns around the criminalization, the scope of criminalization, about the powers, the investigative powers without safeguards, and the scope of international cooperation. And you mentioned various bits. So I want to maybe kind of, we can delve a little bit more into those different 3 dimensions to really kind of help unpack them and what they mean actually in practice, right? Because as you said, Tanya, if they go with this approach, there will be ramifications that perhaps will be irreversible. What does that actually mean? What does it look like in practice? So I'd like to pick up on a couple of issues to start with, and maybe starting with you, Rahman. You said a couple of times, we don't want this treaty to make us more insecure. And you talked about security researchers and the like, and Caitlin also mentioned that. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that in sort of layman terms? Can you give us concrete examples? What would that look like in practice? And Caitlin as well, if you can comment on this point.
More than happy to. And like, as I've mentioned, in the section on criminalization in the draft treaty text, particularly those in regards to Article 6 to approximately what used to be Article 10, those are what are called core cybercrimes, network intrusion crimes, of, say, hacking a device, other means that you might follow and what you may be able to do there. As we mentioned, we believe that there should be an intentionality requirement in either all of the articles, or there should be a catch-all provision, a safeguard or safe harbor that says that any of these activities, if it's conducted, without intent or for the purposes of security research, journalism, or other potential areas should be protected. Those are simple options that states could follow. And perhaps even more basic than that, as we've noted, there is some existing language on penetration testing that is included in one of the articles, but not in all of them. And when I look at that, I say like that, this is a very basic drafting error. I'm surprised that that is still stayed in, despite the fact that it's been pointed out in every negotiating session this year. But that sort of, for example, exception that's there in the current measure, if that was applied to Articles, say, 6, 7, and 8, that would be a basic step there. And even simple things like removing words like authorized testing, even saying if testing takes place in a responsible way or following ethical guidelines or other measures like that, that would be helpful. The other sort of simple step that states could take is also in the section on prosecution and how prosecution should take place. If they say that states should undertake all possible efforts to make sure that prosecutors are guided to avoid prosecuting human rights defenders, security researchers, and others, that would also be helpful because, for example, that is the path that some states have chosen to follow. If you look at, for example, the Netherlands as well as the United States, they have not necessarily amended or changed their core laws passed by their national parliaments or Congress, but they've issued binding and sometimes exhaustive executive branch guidance on this. But you need to make that explicit. My simple standard here would be to say, if an international instrument coming from the UN in 2023, 2024 talks about cybercrime provisions, it should talk about and recognize the misuse there. And it should tell states explicitly, here are the steps you must take, whether at your legislative level or your executive level, to ensure that legitimate activity, including human rights defender work, journalism and security research, is not targeted. Those are simple tests that we can, or simple changes that we can see there. And I hope it's done by January. I am concerned, though, that many states still seem to be averse to changing this, and they'll say we'll fix it in implementation. All that will mean is for 10% of the states globally, they will fix it in implementation. For the majority of states, they will go by the text that's in this UN treaty system document.
As you say, Rahman, it's not enough to allude to certain protections. You have to make sure that it's absolutely tight. Then when states transpose this into their national laws, then they do that in the right way that protects and limits the scope of abuse. Caitlin, you talked about how these kind of provisions might impact the work that people at Google do. Can you just tell us a little bit more practically what would that look like?
Yeah, of course. Rahman, I cannot agree with you enough. I thought that was fantastic. Exactly what you said about the US and Netherlands and like-minded countries, they're going to look at something like the unauthorized access provisions and say, well, it looks very similar to our national law, right? In the US, it looks very similar to the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. But we know as practitioners that that's not really the case, that the US DOJ here has issued additional guidance about protecting good faith cybersecurity researchers, that the US Supreme Court recently in Van Buren a few years ago has looked at this issue again and drawn really clear delineations about what is ethical hacking and what is truly unauthorized access. And none of that legislative work, None of that guidance is making its way into the UN treaty. And so here you're just kind of getting the black letter of the law, absent any of this helpful nuance. Insofar as how this impacts Google researchers, Google engineers, we have, you know, the best and brightest working for us and with us to find vulnerabilities in our systems. Like Roman mentioned, sometimes those individuals are contracted, sometimes not. Sometimes they work through our bug bounty process, and they're just folks on the web who really care, who found something in their Gmail, for example, some bit of spam, some way that users could be harmed, and want to report it to us. And so we want to protect those individuals, as well as the people who work, for example, within our threat analysis group, combating in particular nation state attacks on our systems.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think you kind of raised an important point that these discussions are not happening for the first time, right? There are all these kind of developments at the national level, all this nuance that can be very helpful to clarify how one might approach these very complex issues. Going to the issue of what's in scope, what is cybercrime, and a question perhaps to Tanya and Ian before I turn back to you, Amy, talk about the sort of specific case of journalists. We saw a paper from Russia talking about the importance of including extremism, terrorism in this convention, and reason being that these are very important issues that are happening, and you know, all these terrorist actors, ISIS and the like, are using ICTs to conduct their activities. So one might sort of ask the question, what's wrong with including, you know, extremism and terrorism in this convention? We already included CSAM and not necessarily pure cybercrimes. What is the problem with that from your perspective? And what are some of the things that you worry about if the convention were to follow a similar approach? Yes.
Thank you very much, Joyce. And I would say, as I said, on the bright side, I'm very happy that it wasn't included. I think that we have to look at Russia's paper and combination counter paper, where they outline that terrorism and extremism are covered mostly by existing laws and existing instruments. What I do have fear of is that the states, our seeking for compromise, will actually add something like prohibition on terrorist activities. I doubt about extremism because I believe that the OHCHR somewhere even officially said that provisions on extremism has no purchase, you know, in the international frameworks, because you can never, ever shape on extremism in a way that will not be vague, that will not be misinterpreted. And this is why this is one of the main reasons I think they should not be in the international instrument. You cannot make them prone to misinterpretation. And here comes some other concerns from me related to this convention. You know, it's interesting because I think that we are so we are, for a good reason, we're so much obsessed with speech criminalization, with terrorism and extremism, while the state's actually trying to weasel some other very vague provisions, like the Article 17, which is now in italic, which is now in informal or formal negotiations about crimes and, you know, and or some other vague provisions like other illegal acts. They are not there, but again, maybe at the 11th hour, states would agree to put this in. It has to be limited in scope. But I'm sorry for getting so lawyerish, but I think it is important for me as for a lawyer to highlight a couple of things. As I said, we're so obsessed with one thing, we are not looking at some nuances which might make life much harder. And here I'm talking about two articles. Fraud. So when I look at it, and if you ever open a draft, you can look at it. And the subsections A and B are very clear. To me, they should be there. They criminalize fraud by manipulation with data or interference with computer system, all clear cut. Don't know how and who somebody put the subsection C, which now criminalizes any deception as to factual circumstances made using a computer system that causes a person to do or omit to do anything which that person would not otherwise do or omit to do. I mean, I'm sorry. The first principle of criminal law, the cornerstone principle, should be clear what is criminalized, so it would be easy for citizens to regulate their behavior and for law enforcement to apply these articles. To me, this omission to do something that a person otherwise would not admit to do is so ridiculously vague. It's so open to misinterpretations. And if you want me to take it to a level of absurdity, I think you can even criminalize fake news by journalists and bloggers who get some honorarium, a personal gain from publishing blogs and newspapers. It will fall under this if you misinterpret it in a right way, And secondly, I would like to highlight Article 13, which changed only one word from shall to may. It said that it's crimes related to child sexual abuse online. It said before the states shall take steps to exclude the criminalization of children for self-generated material. So basically, it's about not criminalizing children, and in particular adolescents, sharing self-generated picture and sexual content. Now it says that the states may choose not to criminalize it. And to me, first of all, it contradicts to very clear recommendations of the child to avoid criminalizing adolescents of similar ages for factually consensual and non-exploitative sharing of materials. I do understand there are various cultural differences and national traditions and whatsoever, but giving green light to criminalization of legitimate communication between adolescents by the virtue of the UN Convention is absolutely a no-go for me, and it's not acceptable. So I just want to urge, if there are any delegations listening to this, please make sure that this may versus shall does not fall through the cracks. These activities should not be criminalized, and not give green light to criminalize them by the virtue of the UN treaty. So this is all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. And I think you kind of raised very important points around, we should not focus on one of the issues in the treaty and sort of like forget about the others, because, there are several issues that need to be addressed in tandem, and about the importance of specificity in legal instruments, because then, citizens will be able to regulate their conduct accordingly, law enforcement will be able to implement the law, etc. And so opening the door for these vague interpretations is quite concerning. And I guess, if we look at national practices when it comes to laws around extremism, terrorism, they criminalize a very, very wide range of conduct or online content. And that is what some of the, concerns have focused on. Ian, would you like to add anything on this point, on the criminalization chapter more generally? What are the things that you're mostly concerned about?
No, sure. I mean, obviously, Tatiana's made some extremely important points. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I'll come at the same question from a kind of slightly different angle, which is, like she has said, when there's such different interpretations of what, for example, terrorism and extremism is, it's hard to put that into a treaty. And maybe if I can kind of compare this with kind of a convention that my organization is much more used to dealing with, which is the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, even though they couldn't define organized crime, the premise on which they entered the negotiations was that they had a common vision of what the type of activity and the type of group was that they saw as a threat, and that they were trying to do something about. In that case, it was, in transnational mafia-style groups carrying out various types of serious crime. In this case, by trying to add in these extra elements, you're just making it more confused and less workable, in fact, as well as opening it up to risk. And I just kind of wanted to make one point about this kind of quite fundamental issue, I feel, which is when you're trying to negotiate between two ends of a spectrum where there's quite fundamental differences between them, you know, any move in one direction from the base of nothing that we have now is a move towards the other end of the spectrum. What I mean by that is this is not a political declaration where you're trying to come to a form of words that's acceptable to everybody. You're coming to agreement on not only a legal framework, but also a vision of what the UN is for states and what it is for people. There is a real danger that by going down a certain road that this draft is leading us down, that the UN is moving away or is being used not to safeguard human rights and the other fundamental values that the UN is based, but to legitimize behaviors that run counter to those values. And the UN can be used and reshaped under in a quite negative and dangerous way.
Thank you, Ian. And I guess it's a kind of a good time to remind everyone that if this convention comes to fruition, this will be the first UN convention on any cyber issue, right? So that's quite an important issue, not only for cybercrime, but for any binding instrument that might come afterwards on a cyber issue. Amy, you talked about the concerns that you have from a journalistic from the IPI's perspective. And you said that you're worried that this convention might become a tool to punish journalists, and particularly those who kind of are operating in exile. Can you just elaborate a little bit on that? What do you mean by this? And what are sort of your experiences working in difficult contexts around the world, and how this convention might exacerbate existing problems?
Yeah, great. Thank you. I mean, I think I want to start and building off a few things that were said earlier that I totally agree with, which is, you know, kind of zooming out a little bit, that, I mean, for IPI, the entire treaty actually causes us a lot of concern. I mean, the treaty really reflects, I think, some of the pressures on the multilateral system, and that are really threatening the foundations of human rights. And I think it's part of a bigger trend of the use of legal mechanisms, or so-called lawfare, against the press and against critics, that is really kind of chipping away at fundamental rights. You know, so this treaty comes at a time when journalists and media are under great pressure, like I said earlier, and human rights and democracy are kind of in crisis. So at this moment, we really need to double down on human rights commitments and principles, and figure out a way to hold states accountable for those principles and commitments. And we need strong enabling policies, in other words. And I think this treaty kind of is moving entirely in the wrong direction. But regarding specific concerns around, regarding journalists, the scope of the crimes potentially covered under this convention has been a great concern to us from the outset, and in particular, provisions on surveillance. IPI has been among the many organizations that have called for a much more narrow scope of crimes covered under the convention, and for the treaty to really focus on cyber-dependent crimes. One of the main concerns that we have is a lot of this draft, has kind of the same scope of domestic cyber crimes laws. And as we've seen around the world over the past several years, there's been an alarming use of cyber crimes legislation against journalists and against activists and critics. I can just give a couple of quick examples, because I think it's important to think about what types of laws that we're talking about. Again, well, there's at least 150 countries around the world have current cyber crimes laws on the books. Many of these are overbroad. Many of them deal with materials that go far beyond cyber crimes, cyber dependent crimes, and go into areas dealing with content, and are often used to target, journalists and critics. For instance, in China, China's 2016 cybersecurity law criminalizes the use of the internet for purposes of damaging national unity. In Pakistan, scores of journalists have been arrested on charges of violating the country's 2016 Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act. This law criminalizes online speech that brings the armed forces, judiciary, or intelligence agencies into disrepute. Numerous journalists have been in the Philippines have been targeted and charged with cyber libel under the country's vague and overbroad cybercrimes law, including Maria Ressa, Nobel laureate, whose outlet Rappler often investigates government corruption and crime. In Niger, a journalist just a few months ago was charged with disseminating data likely to disturb the public order under the country's 2019 cybercrimes law, which has been used repeatedly against journalists and researchers over the last few years. And again, like the list of similar examples is of governments abusing, these laws is so big, it's really difficult to choose examples. Many of these laws could fall under the widened or vague scope of the convention, and most of these laws criminalize online behaviors and expression that are actually protected under international human rights law and by the UN Charter.
Going back on years of struggle to kind of ensure protection for this protected speech. Thank you very much for this, Amy. I think that was quite a good overview. I just want to talk about the kind of the powers that law enforcement particularly will get from this convention as it is currently drafted. Some of you talked about the concerns that you have around real-time collection of traffic data and the kind of extensive surveillance powers that this convention might allow without the right safeguards. I think some of the big tech so even referring to this draft as a global data access treaty as opposed to a treaty to curb cybercrime. Can you just tell us a little bit more about those aspects in that chapter that are mostly concerning? I don't know if I can start with you, Caitlin, and then Raman and anyone else who might want to comment on this.
Sure. And I just want to echo what Amy said. It's really helpful when we're looking at cybercrime texts to start with how the text will impact vulnerable populations, including journalists. So I'm thinking about security researchers, whistleblowers, and children. Tatiana, what you mentioned about the CSAM provision resonates. It really could criminalize children for self-generating imagery, as well as even writing fictitious, patently offensive text, which is oftentimes covered by free speech principles, right? And while we all said the text isn't the worst case scenario, just because it dropped, the fake news proposal and other things along those lines, it doesn't mean that the catch-all provisions like Article 17 aren't incredibly worrisome. So to the point of jurisdiction and scope, the new text outlines this kind of custody and control nature or language, which really allows one member state to request a service provider in a second member state to turn over data located in yet a third member state without that third member state's knowledge or ability to assert rights on behalf of their citizens, right? This is all done in secrecy without any awareness at the third member state level. This basically means that any government that signs up for the treaty is going to be able to demand data held in a third location, absent that third location's control or knowledge. For service providers in particular, it means if you have an office in a certain location, if you have a server space in a certain location, that data could be compromised under the access provisions. So it's incredibly worrisome. And just to say too, we're talking about criminalization here. The data that is being demanded, the electronic evidence that's being demanded, is intended to be used in the prosecution of the crimes that we've chatted about here today, right? So it's problematic on a few different fronts.
Raman?
Happy to add a bit more. I think here it's useful to go towards what, the fourth chapter of this proposed treaty. And, the one thing I always find useful, speaking to criminal lawyers is when they say, when you hear the words law enforcement and procedure, be cautious and careful, because those innocuous words have massive implications for human rights, journalism, and more generally for how power is used in societies, for good or for bad, right? And I think what's concerning there, firstly, is that the current proposed procedural measures in our view are still too broad. And I think that's remained in the treaty. There's been a lot of discussion from the beginning that procedural measures should ideally be only for those crimes criminalized in the treaty itself and shouldn't apply for every single measure. I think, unfortunately, what seems to be retained in this treaty text is an approach that says they may be used for beyond just the core crimes proposed to be criminalized in the previous chapter of the treaty, which we think is one basic problem. If you're doing a treaty, ideally all those provisions should relate to what is proposed to be criminalized rather than catch-all provisions. We think it's confusing. It adds degree to create even, say, state-to-state disagreements, but also more importantly, it sneaks in a whole bunch of content there that we think should not be part of this, right? Because then, in fact, you do have an international, for all purposes, electronic crime procedure and justice treaty in a form, but without upgrading the safeguards that we so much, very, very much want to see. I think there, Caitlin's talked about the sort of liability, and in fact, this current draft seems to potentially expand the scope of who can be covered in terms of if a service provider is in one jurisdiction, but data is held elsewhere, and that's something we're analyzing further and hope to further speak about publicly. I think we're particularly worried that when it comes to requests such as expedited preservation of data and other things, that here the safeguards are not strong enough. They're often here saying, language that, states can put these in. They don't necessarily require it to be a judicial standard. And I think it's telling that when you're part of the process, we even made the intervention there saying that when you're asking for preservation of data, ideally that should also be subject to a judicial warrant mechanism and process. And in fact, don't even open-ended, require states to say that it should be through a judicial process or something equivalent to judicial process, sufficient safeguards. Even for things such as basic some states regard to as metadata, there's some variance to include that there. But what's perhaps most alarming is that the language used in this treaty, in fact, again, disregards all the learnings that we have in the post-Snowden era. Metadata and content data are not strict binaries, as we discovered. Metadata deserves as much protection, perhaps even sometimes more so, than content data collected at mass scale. And this treaty does not do that. And in many ways, going back to the brief mention that you made of, this is a data access treaty, Joyce, I think the worry that many of us have is that this treaty is actually dragging us back and codifying a legal architecture that is pre-Snowden, that does not recognize the abuse that takes place nationally, again, whether through gray areas or through intentional measures, and is not strong and safe and strong and secure enough. And I think one important part there, I think, which is sort of the disappointing simple thing that could have been fixed, is in the safeguard provision when it comes to what used to be Article 24. The language there, the test they put in is about proportionality. And I say it's quite helpful to look at all the other language coming from the UN, which is very clear. It is necessity, legality, and proportionality. And those standards are understood regionally, domestically, in many countries. And the fact that we can't even use the full provisions here, we're already cutting it down to say, this is like a budget version of the human rights standard proportionality that you should be happy with, is very, very alarming. And I think that's why in many ways, what I'm worried about is that not that this treaty is failing to improve international criminal justice provisions on data access, which I hoped it would do. It's actually dragging us back to, as I mentioned, a pre-Snowden era.
Thank you for those excellent points, Raman. Just to kind of talk about what needs to change to avoid these scenarios. We talked in chapter 1 on criminalization, Article 17, catch-all, a bit dodgy, so maybe we shouldn't be there. It's a chapter on procedures. There have been sort of calls for either deletion of articles, some articles, particularly, the scope of application of those measures, or around, certain powers, and introducing safeguards. What are the kind of key messages that you're trying to communicate, Raman, on this particular issue?
And the range of ones, as we said, in an ideal world, Article 17 should not exist. And I think, Ian has hinted a bit to this, right? That some of the political balancing is causing very complicated, problematic, substantive legal language. And namely, that balancing is that the negotiating party, some of the key negotiating parties in this don't want to say to a large number of states that this should be a very narrow treaty. And what they're saying is, it will be a narrow treaty, but it will give you a broad catch-all that you could use. And we're limiting it to, say, be international legal instruments. But simple, even if, as we believe, 17 should be removed. But if you keep 17, it should be limited to UN legal instruments. It should be perhaps an option to states. It should not be, a broad catch-all that they can easily use. It should be optional. And even each usage or each measure where states choose to criminalize other materials should be reported to the conference of parties, the oversight mechanism that is proposed to be created in this treaty. But those are basic And again, I would say many of my colleagues in society have even stronger recommendations they could make. But that is one set of like changes we would believe should be included. And the other one, as I mentioned, is very clear. Article 24 at minimum needs to categorically say necessity, legality, and proportionality. And we believe there should be explicit, again, references to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Economic Social Rights, or any other human rights instruments there. And if states are unwilling to sign that, I would say then they should not be part of this treaty, and this treaty should not exist. That is the best civilized standard that we require when it comes to international cooperation on data in 2024 onwards.
Thank you. And I don't know if any other speakers want to comment on this particular point. But Amy, you mentioned before about how the powers can impact journalists, and you talked a little bit about that. I wonder how much of the the concerns that have been raised are ones that you share as well. Are there some particular aspects that you are kind of mostly sort of worried about, and what would be your suggestion to kind of limit the scope of this abuse?
Thank you. I mean, I think in addition to other things that have been mentioned, I would say the surveillance powers are probably one of the most concerning, and the potential impact for the potential for abuse. We've already seen, obviously, that what governments are willing to do in terms of surveilling journalists. There's a lot, in the last few years, we've seen the rise of governments using commercial, illicit, Pegasus and other types of spyware. And, in our opinion, I think this could actually further entrench kind of these types of behaviors. And I think given, how highly intrusive these powers are, that all of the provisions around surveillance need to be significantly bolstered with human rights protections, and possibly some of the articles deleted completely. They're very dangerous provisions, especially given the current climate right now. So we would recommend really looking at the surveillance provisions and making sure that those provisions are very narrow and can only be carried out in the narrowest of circumstances.
Moving on now to talking about the international cooperation, which we've talked about a little bit in the so far, and in this chapter there is the scope that is that has raised some concerns, particularly what is it that states should cooperate on, the offenses in the convention plus serious crimes, and there are all these kind of questions around what is serious crimes and what sort of scenarios might this kind of provision facilitate, particularly talking here about exchange of e-evidence. Ian, you mentioned UNTOC, the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime, and you've written before that this approach of serious crimes is taken from UNTOC, but you talk about, well, it's different. You can't apply the same approach in UNTOC in this convention. Can you tell us why, and what are the kind of main, or like, the sort of the worst case scenarios that you worry about from adopting this approach?
No, thank you. And yeah, definitely this is a big concern. I think maybe in some cases a misunderstanding of how the kind of threshold for serious crime is applied using the UNTOC. As I was saying earlier, the common vision of the activity that the negotiators who came up with that treaty were adopting was on this transnational. So they had to agree that it was transnational, so operating across borders. That's the common threat. They had to agree on the type of group that was doing it. They went for 3 people or more in a structured group, and then they had to agree on the seriousness of the offence. And this is where the serious crime definition came up, which was for any offence where you get 3 or more years in prison. So that is a very long list, and I think Amy has kind of explained all the things that are illegal under in many countries. When you narrow it down with the transnational nature and the organized criminal group, it becomes a lot narrower, and it gives the treaty a focus, and it becomes an inbuilt safeguard against some of those abuses, even though the human rights language is not explicit in the UNTOC. The other thing I would say, it was negotiated in a different time, a different geopolitical time where these kind of things were more possible. You probably couldn't negotiate it now. And in addition, that ad hoc committee had more meetings by a fair amount, and also negotiated and adopted 100 interpretive notes that form part of the travaux préparatoires that was produced after the treaty. As I understand it, and I think this is still the case, there are no plans for a travaux préparatoire for this convention, which is concerning in itself when you consider how much more complex the issues being negotiated are here than they were for that convention. I think when you ask about the...
Can you explain what travaux préparatoires are in the context of
sure. So I think in the case of UNTOC, and maybe others will have experience with other conventions as well, essentially it's a guide explaining how things were negotiated, how they got to that point, and what they mean legally. They're very big and give you a lot of legal advice for how to implement the treaty. I think in terms of your, you also realize that I can't say travaux préparatoire for some reason. It's a very long French word. I'm British, so sorry about that. The worst case scenario under this is, in my opinion, the possibility for two states with equally authoritarian outlooks and regimes to cooperate with each other, or even share evidence with each other. In my opinion, sharing evidence is not a benign, sharing electronic evidence is not a benign activity, as it's sometimes been characterized in these negotiations. And the question I get back is, oh, it's okay, you know, these countries, they want to cooperate with each other anyway. You know, what difference does this make? The difference that it makes is that they can do so, and they can say, look, the UN says we should be doing this, and there's nothing you can do to complain about it. This is what the UN says we should be doing. And that's the worst case scenario. And, you know, when you look at the types of activities, you could be looking at LGBT communities, you could be looking at journalists, you could be looking at all kinds of people criticizing the governments online, or, you know, whatever it may be. As it's currently drafted, that's essentially what we're looking at.
Thank you, Ian, for that. I want to come to Tanya for this point as well, but Roman, you have your hand up, so please go ahead.
I just wanted to briefly add to that, and I probably still mispronounce travaux préparatoires. I think it is a Commonwealth legacy. We can't pronounce French well, but just to go to that, I think it's very important to know that ultimately international law is very much about what states believe the law is in state practice, and what travaux préparatoires documents essentially help is to say this is what states agreed to would be the understanding beyond just the text itself. Other instruments sometimes even have clearer explanatory notes. I think Ian mentioned that, you know, UNTOCs had them, but in the context of, say, the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, as well as second additional protocol, you have an interpretive document that's helpful there. Even there, as we know, many of us believe that those safeguards and the document are not enough. Much more is needed, even in the context of the Budapest Convention. But even there, you saw clear guidance. And we are essentially now ending up in the circumstance with the UNHCA process, where a contested document, incredibly contested language, is going to end up with not even agreement on preparing the collection of materials that, you know, that outline what negotiators thought they were saying when they drafted this, which is very, very alarming. Because in effect, what you are ending up with is a document that's going to add more international legal confusion. And I think going back to what Ian mentioned as well, right? It's not just about, you know, states will be compelled to agree to the treaty text. The thing is that in many countries' case, they have domestic and constitutional requirements on when they can say provide access to data, when particular, you know, spaces of intrusion privacy can be allowed. Some states do allow for exceptions for international legal commitments, but if that's not cleared up here, in effect, this is a backdoor to strong constitutional or privacy law safeguards domestically. But more importantly, for some states who don't have clarity on how the treaty will be used, they will come back and say, well, our domestic legal system doesn't allow us to provide data if we don't think it's going to be properly safeguarded. And states requesting data would be frustrated. So ironically, for many of the states actually asking for cross-border cooperation, the current form of this treaty will actually frustrate their efforts because they will not get the cooperation they're seeking from many of the states where providers and internet intermediaries might be located, because that it doesn't match up with their domestic and constitutional legal safeguards, because it's not just a political process, right? There are domestic legal requirements that many states need to meet up to.
I won't go to you, Tanya, just in the interest of time, and we have like a set of like good questions that I'd like to cover. So what I will do is basically I'll read all the questions that my colleagues have kindly organized thematically. So I'm going to read them all to you, and what we will do is I'll go through the screen, and you can comment and answer whatever question you would like. So we have a couple of questions on vulnerable groups and gender in the convention, and the first one is, how is the convention referring to images, and how the convention might respond to cybercrimes relating to gender and ethnicity? Is the convention adequately and comprehensively assuring protections for minority groups? How can this be improved? And relatedly to this, a question from Sam K, whether the convention, or if the convention, covers tech-facilitated violence against women. The articles in the convention are A15 on non-consensual dissemination of intimate images, and there's also a mention of eradicated gender-based violence in the preventive measures chapter. Do the panel think these provisions are sufficient? And maybe when you comment on this, whether the sort of mention of mainstreaming gender in the preamble, you see it as sufficient in the convention or not. On the human rights and safeguards, a question from Emily Taylor about whether it is possible to balance between greater legal certainty, international cooperation, and the need to safeguard human rights and avoid repression. Is there a way to achieve both goals? Is it a hopeless case? If it's hopeless, are we comfortable with the impunity for cyber criminals that will continue until international cooperation is strengthened? And a question from Wolfgang, I'm not going to attempt to pronounce your surname, with all the concerns, which I guess is a kind of a question to the end, what will happen if there is no consensus after the final session? Voting, two competitive regimes as the COE versus UN, a situation similar to ITU, was said 2014. So what are your views on potential scenarios? And three more, and I'll stop, I promise. From Tommaso Falchetta, he asked whether, he basically says that the Russian Federation and others have been pushing for a broad scope of the treaty, and that's not surprising. But what is surprising and concerning is that EU, US, and other states have failed to effectively limit this approach and prevent the extension of the provisions on law enforcement and international cooperation with no meaningful human rights safeguards. How can we ensure that these states reaffirm some of the positions they adopted in the early stages of the negotiations and avoid allowing this draft to go through? Is there hope that the convention can be improved in the time remaining? And the last two, from book, Ryan Chang talks about digital skills are taught in education settings. Is this adequately covered in the convention? And what should the convention do to raise awareness of and prevent cyber crimes in this way? I'm not really sure what this is referring to. And then a question from Ifeanyi Ikerioni and Tim Reed about cybercrimes in a broader context, for example, in the context of pursuit of war. How might the convention be used outside of its particular confines? We might refer to the US submission, and how can those working on or familiar with work going on in the first committee leverage this convention's work and process to help address state-sponsored cyber activities, for example? So wide range of questions. I'm not sure how helpful it was for me to go through all of them at once, but I hope you were taking notes, and I think my colleagues have been putting them in the chat. So, okay, who would like to go first? Shall I start with you? Tanya, please go ahead.
Gladly. I actually wrote down 4 questions which I would like to cover, but for the interest of time, I will try to cover them in broad brush strokes. First, Emily Taylor, about possibility in cooperating against cybercrime and still preserving human rights, or is it kind of hopeless case, or and we're just perpetuating impunity for cyber criminals? And I would just say that to me, these two debates should be detangled. The impunity for criminals is perpetuated not only because we have no internet cybercrime. The impunity of cybercriminals starts with a very low level, and we saw comments on this Q&A panel when people come to the police and police is doing nothing. So it starts with a very low level, and sometimes it has zero to do whether EU, US, Russia, China, and Caribbean countries can join this convention. It's all about the mindset. It's all about strengthening capacity. Whether it is possible to balance, yes, it is very much possible. And I would say that with certain strong tweaks, this treaty could really achieve the goal of enabling international cooperation and protecting human rights. And I would say that when we think about this, we should forget the word cybercrime. Starting from investigative powers and international cooperation, it is not about impunity of cybercriminals anymore. It is a global treaty on getting access to digital evidence for any crime, whether this is a crime established with following human rights and safeguards, or it's very arbitrary provision. And this is what we have to bear in mind. It's not about impunity of cyber criminals. It is about any crime that can leave digital traces. About the situation with two standards following the ITU Wiki 2014, Wolfgang, correct me if I'm wrong, and you can write to me privately. I have not seen any problem in the fact that we are having two sets of international telecommunications regulations. The telecom hasn't fallen apart. The infrastructure hasn't fallen apart. So I do not see a problem that we have two standards. I would see a problem if, when it comes to voting, when there is no consensus, 2/3 of the countries will vote for the treaty which waters down human rights. This would be a very, very, very bad outcome, even if democratic countries. About Russia pushing and other countries pushing for broad scope, and EU and US did not take a strong enough stand. You know what? I would agree. I would agree that, of course, we can blame Russia, China, Iran, and other countries for everything they try to push there, insert there. I would say that, dear European Union, dear United States, dear Australia, dear Canada, dear United Kingdom, also take a strong stance here. We have to know what are non-negotiables. And basically, to me, in the current stand, this draft is completely non-negotiable. And finally, I'm sorry that it's taken long, on gender. I believe that this convention is taking a very strong first step on ensuring the gender mainstreaming into international treaty. But to me, it's twofold. So on the one hand, we have this provision on non-consensual image sharing. And this is really great because even the EU in Digital Services Act couldn't come to compromise on this. But it is only now within the framework of this convention. Criminal punishment is not enough. The most harm is caused by also image staying there. And this convention does nothing, and it shouldn't do anything because it doesn't regulate the eyes. It is not a content that is obviously illegal. The provider doesn't know if the consent was given or not. So we are not solving these issues. Where it goes bad about gender and marginalized communities and communities that we have to protect. And I'm not talking only about women and girls. I'm talking about non-binary people. I'm talking about LGBTQ communities. The framework for international cooperation does nothing to protect them. It endangers them. So in this regard, I do not believe at any point that this convention is mainstreaming gender by lowering down safeguards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Caitlin.
Tanya, thank you so much for that. I think the NCI, the non-consensual sexually explicit imagery provision, is really an interesting place to start here. Facially, it seems very reasonable. The imagery outlined is basically visual depictions taken in a private setting where a person has an expectation of privacy, and that image has been shared absent that individual's consent. But if you really look at it and examine the scope, the provision criminalizes anyone selling, distributing, transmitting, publishing an image without the consent of the original individual depicted. How that individual gives consent is not explained. How consent is tracked across the web is never outlined. And frankly, it's often impossible to ascertain consent when you're merely transmitting an image, even in cases where an image might be being shared, not kind of on the web, but between two individuals in private communications. So that poses its own privacy issues, right? How do you garner consent from an individual who maybe is or is not named? And second to this, intimate imagery is also imagery in which a person's sexual parts are exposed. I don't think that nations necessarily have a shared definition of what a sexual part is or isn't. And so that really speaks to the vagueness and overbreadth of some of these provisions that are themselves great and we would want to see in the convention, but in actual text are not being translated very well. And Ian noted earlier that the convention as a whole could easily be used as a weapon against LGBTQ individuals. I completely agree. LGBTQ persons have long had their behaviors and identities criminalized. Right now, more than 70 countries criminalize individuals for being or expressing same-sex interest. And it would be very easy to imagine, for example, the CSAM or NCAI provisions being used to weaponize behaviors as simple as online dating, posting photos in your own profile, sharing those online. And when we think about who is generally prosecuted for these types of behaviors, it's oftentimes individuals within vulnerable communities.
Brilliant. Thank you. Ian.
Thank you. I mean, I'll respond. I just wanted to respond to a couple of the kind of questions on the kind of way forward and the outcome. I think some of the other questions are a bit too technical for my expertise. I think I would agree with what was said by Tatiana about the issue of impunity, because, yeah, I think that's a kind of a false choice. I think, you know, these discussions have been going on a long time. It's not just the last 2 years. And for many years, there were groups, you know, a group of states who successfully, you know, were able to, you know, push back on this process starting. And for a variety of reasons, including the human rights and data protections concerns. And now that we've kind of gone through the motions of this ad hoc committee, we can see that those fears and those reasons were completely valid, and there was good reason to take that approach. But now we are where we are, almost at the end of this process. There's a question about, you know, what happens with voting, and as I understand the modalities, the committee is supposed to present a convention to the General Assembly when this at the end of its session in February, and it should exhaust all options to come to agreement by consensus. Given what we've discussed, that seems like an unlikely outcome, and actually, based on the positions that we have put forward as this group today, I think an undesirable outcome when you think about what's possible on that spectrum between a narrow treaty with strong safeguards and anything more than that. But I would say that there is it's still time to consider kind of any variety of options for how to address that last meeting, and I'm sure lots of countries from various points across the spectrum are doing the same thing as it pertains to their own interests. Just a kind of final point, I guess, on the effectiveness of conventions, this issue of, you know, if you give up on this process, or if you somehow, if the committee fails to achieve its mandate, is it a hopeless case? Is it allowing cyber criminals impunity? I mean, I would say that, you know, we look at transnational organized crime, which is all member states have signed up to that convention. The problem is worse than it ever has been 20 years later, since it was adopted. So I don't think we should be under any illusions of the effectiveness of such conventions. But what we can strive for is a treaty that does build trust to increase international cooperation against what we can agree is a cybercrime, and we shouldn't see the human rights safeguards and the other safeguards as a spoiler, but rather an enabler of international cooperation.
This is such a beautiful summary, and you kind of gave me my closing, basically. But I still have Amy. So Amy, over to you, and we'll still have 3 minutes, and we can conclude.
Yeah, no, I'll be really, really brief. I think I appreciate the question about, the geopolitics of this, because I think at this point, this has actually become quite a political process. And will have political outcomes. I think that I agree with others that the positions of the US and the EU have been quite disappointing in some regards, and they need to be much stronger in terms of scope, especially and also issues around human rights. I do think, though, that some countries like Canada has been a bit stronger on this issue, and hopefully they're able to kind of move some countries closer to the narrow scope, strong human rights guard camp as we move closer and closer to the end of the negotiations. I think that remains to be seen. But I do think overall that in some ways this process has been, building momentum, and there's more and more countries paying attention to it. And I think there was for a long time a lack of alignment within countries about how they're positioned on this treaty. And I think now, hopefully, as we move more towards January, that countries are kind of realizing the severity of this treaty and are going to take this more seriously, and hopefully in January.
Thank you very much, Amy. And just to conclude on a positive note, as you said, that this treaty has managed, or this process has managed to raise more awareness, not only on the problem of cybercrime, but also on the complexity of responding to cybercrime and the importance of international cooperation. And I think this conversation today should hopefully be a kind of good reminder that we should be fighting cybercrime. The treaty should not be targeted at shrinking civil society space, targeting media, or controlling online speech, or invading privacy without any transparency or safeguards. We've heard repeatedly, and we've in the room in the negotiations, but also elsewhere, about this big appetite that a lot of countries have for a practical legal instruments that could help them do international cooperation better. As you said, Ian, it's not going to be a silver bullet, but it can build trust, it can facilitate international cooperation, and it can help states help each other build their capacity when it comes to this complex issue that will become even more complex with the advent of technology. So I think the message that we're all sort of saying, this situation is not ideal. However, there are very clear fixes that, if adopted, can turn this convention into a positive tool. And I think this is kind of the positive note I'd like to leave our participants with, that, we still have time. Member states still have time. Civil society, industry, and all of us have been contributing throughout the process. There are practical solutions and recommendations that can be implemented. It will all sort of depend on the political will of states and whether this can actually happen or not. But thank you very much for all the panelists. This has been a very interesting and rich discussion. I thank you very much for your time, and thank the attendees as well for their questions and for their interest. And we look forward to staying in touch, and until we meet at the next event. Thank you very much.